Hey everyone, we're back here on the Whirling Circles Internal Martial Arts Podcast. I'm Sean Garcia, joined of course by Frank Allen. Frank, we're coming on our second month here. How you feeling about the podcast?
Seems to be going pretty well.
Awesome, yeah. We just finished up the series on talking about the like introductions to the three main Chinese internal martial arts, and now we're going to be going into some other kind of specific topics. This week specifically, we're going to be talking about the history of Chinese martial arts in New York City, which you've been in New York City for a few decades, teaching martial arts here, and of course you've been around the scene, and so it's great to have a veteran of the Chinese martial arts scene in New York City to be able to talk about some of the history. So we're going to be talking about this week, and next week actually we're going to be talking about. We're going to go specifically into Bagua and talk about the weapons of Baguazhang. So that should be a really exciting show as well. But before we get started, I just wanted to again thank everybody who has been subscribing to our YouTube channel. We've gotten a couple dozen subscribers now, which is exciting. We also this past week or so, or I guess when you're hearing this, maybe 2 weeks ago, we launched our Instagram. And so definitely follow our Instagram. That's Whirling Circles on Instagram if you're an Instagram user. It's really cool to go on there and see some images of the stuff that we're talking about. So you see Frank and other folks from the Wudang PCA, training in the different systems, and also some of the folks from the lineages that we come from, some images of them. We'll try to get some short clips on there, but it's always good to put those visuals to the stuff that we're talking about. But definitely go ahead and subscribe on YouTube if you haven't. Also click on the little bell button so that you can get notifications when we go live. The shows go live Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And then, of course, follow us on Instagram. And if you haven't already, I know a few of you have already, but if you haven't, definitely head over to iTunes, drop us a review. That's really going to help us, get higher visibility in the podcast world, which is what we're trying to do. We're trying to get this content to more and more people. All right, cool. So let's get into it, Frank. When we're talking about Chinese martial arts in New York City, some people have been part of different systems, and they all have their kind of personal experiences. And of course, we're not going to go over the full spectrum of every single system and every single teacher that's ever taught in New York City. But New York City is a very unique place in the United States when it comes to martial arts. So when did Chinese martial arts start getting to the city? How did that experience happen?
Well, they got here before me. I came here in 1970, and whereas in most of the United States, Chinese martial arts didn't arrive until after Enter the Dragon in the summer of 73, New York already had a Chinese martial arts scene when I arrived in 1970. It had already, in fact, started filtering out of the Chinese only community into the general community. I mean, one of the first people was Jin Foon Mark, who was a praying mantis instructor. Came to New York in the 1940s, started teaching openly in the 1960s. So there's already praying mantis available to anybody who wanted to study with Jin Foon Mark. And I think he was Ralph Mitchell's teacher.
Mm.
And Ralph Mitchell was one of the outstanding Chinese stylists of the 70s. An amazing man, still an amazing man. But he came back from Vietnam and started studying praying mantis and immediately got into competing. And was in those days there wasn't that many Chinese tournaments, so the guys we were competing in would compete in the karate tournaments. And you got to realize karate tournaments in the 60s and 70s weren't like today. They were point fighting, score a point and stop, but the points were scored full contact.
Right.
There was no touch, just barely touch, don't exactly touch kind of stuff that's gone on since then. They were full contact points. And the Chinese guys that were entering there were not real popular usually with the Japanese stylists. I mean, Tiari Cassell out of Chicago was probably one of the first guys, a Shaolin stylist, to get really big in the karate scene. And in fact, one of the better fights I've ever seen was Aaron Banks' Oriental World of Self-Defense put on a Kung Fu versus Karate match in their big shows in the 70s, which was Thierry Cassell versus Little John Davis for karate. And it was an amazing, amazing fight. I think it was decided by 1 point, and I don't really remember who it went to. It was pretty much a draw,
Wow.
but both men really exemplified their styles. And Ralph was doing that with Praying Mantis, as well as entering all of the Chinese martial arts that were around. And there was some good full contact Chinese martial arts happening also. And in fact, in 1973, in East Coast Kung Fu Federation show up at Town Hall, I saw what to this day is, as far as I'm concerned, the best Kung Fu versus Kung Fu fight that I ever saw, which was Ralph Mitchell representing Praying Mantis and Howard Lee representing Tai Chi. And Howard Lee was William Chen's brother-in-law, Priscilla's brother.
Mm.
And needless to say, he was pretty well trained. And they had this tremendous fight with Ralph on the attack with these blitzing, lightning, praying mantis attacks, and Howard completely relaxed, seeming to just slightly deflect stuff that just missing him that would have torn his head off. And then Ralph would land, and then Howard would land a counter, and it was just an amazing, amazing match. Which eventually Ralph won, and he clearly won. There's no disputing him winning, but he won it by a narrow, narrow margin, 1 or 2 points. He won it, but it was just a great fight. Both those guys looked really good all the way around. And then Ralph was one of the guys that went on when full contact karate came in, specifically with the PKA, Professional Karate
Mm.
Association. He started fighting in that. And I'm pretty sure he won their North American Featherweight Championship.
Wow.
And and then since then he's gone integrated different stuff and has an integrated fighting system, which he's around my age and he's still running his integrated fighting system out in Brooklyn and very well respected master who's
Right.
still
Long
there.
before a lot of the other folks try to take that claim of MMA being the first MMA. I have a question. So maybe we can talk about. I mean, it's crazy to think that 1973, that was almost 50 years ago that happened. But the other thing is, why was there's a lot of critiques that the Chinese masters coming into the city, they weren't teaching Americans, and so what was the justification behind that? Why was it a Chinese only thing? And you said that the barrier seemed to have been broken as early as 1940, but a lot of people think it didn't
No,
happen
no,
until the 70s
nineteen
or
forty he was
1950s.
still teaching just
Mm,
um, Chinese. It was the 60s before the barrier started being broken when things in general, morality in general around the world started changing in the 60s. And part of it was that the Chinese finally started teaching non-Chinese people. I mean, there was probably undoubtedly Chinese martial arts here from when the Chinese first started coming in amounts in the 1880s. I mean, they had this tremendous Tong War in the 1880s, 1890s, and you got to know those Tong soldiers were trained, highly trained. And when the Hip Sing took on the An Liang and went from second to equal, and those guys were trained, but no one outside the Chinese community did it. But by the 60s, it started to open up. One of the other big openings was the Fuzhou Pai or Tiger Claw system. In fact, one of the most prolific for teaching people of various types, not just Chinese. And the thing is, there was a Wong Moon Toy who arrived in New York in 1934 and started teaching his Black Tiger system to Chinese in 1940. And one of his better Chinese students was a guy named Hua Hong. And Hua Hong started teaching in 1960, and then in 67 he went public and opened it up to everybody.
mm,
And his Fuzhou Pai School on Canal Street, just past Bowery, a little east of Bari, was there for a long time, very famous. Big sign, couldn't miss it. Hua Hong's Fuzhou Pai. And he started the Fuzhou Pai tournaments. They were the major Chinese martial arts tournaments for a couple of decades. He also was one of the, if not the founder of the Eastern United States Kung Fu Federation that I mentioned earlier. You know, he was a guy that got it all started. And one of his first well-known guys was Huey Chamberlain, who became known as Huey Pai, who had been, he was a Puerto Rican kid from the Bronx whose father was a boxer and trained him in boxing as a kid. And then in the Bronx, he met a Silum, which is Cantonese for Shaolin, by the way, a Silum instructor named Wang Jung, who he studied with for years. And then he got a job in Chinatown at a martial arts supply store. And it's before my time, so it may have been the only martial arts supply store. I think there's only
Mm.
two of them when I got here. And through that, he met everybody. Everybody came in there to buy their equipment, buy their uniforms, buy their books. He met everybody, and he met Hua Hong. And he started training with Hua Hong, and he was obviously really, really good. And he started winning tournaments and winning challenge matches and winning street fights. He was just an amazing, amazing fighter. And he also became a very close friend of Peter Urban, the godfather of New York karate, the Goju stylist that we mentioned in the Tai Chi episode, is the guy who broke up the famous William Chen versus the
Oh,
Shaolin
right.
master fight.
Yes.
Yeah, he and Peter stayed close friends until Peter's death, you know, 35, 40 years later. And from Peter, he got into Zen and has always looked at a lot of his stuff to be Zen oriented as the philosophy behind whatever he's been doing. And in 1973, I think, um, Hua Hong gave him the okay to start a school in Puerto Rico.
Oh, wow. Nice.
So he was one of the first guys to have a branch of Fuzhou Pai other than the home branch in Chinatown, New York. He also, by the way, used to be a sparring partner of Chaka Zulu and Ron Taganashi, who were two of the top karate practitioners, instructors in the city at the time. And he was friends and sparring partners with them. That's how I first heard of him. I had a couple of friends that studied with Zulu, and the people that studied with Zulu knew about Huey Pai. He had some strange stories, which are probably mostly legendary, but they knew about him, that he was really good. And he spent like a decade, decade and a half, long time in Puerto Rico.
Mm.
When he came back, Wao Hung was at least semi-retired, and Huey did not get along with the guys who was sort of running the show at Fuzhou Pai then. So he started his own organization, which I think is still going, and went back to the original name of Black Tiger,
Mm.
which is what Wong Moon Toy was teaching was Black Tiger. And it's all an offshoot of specializing in the tiger or the five animals of the Hung system. In fact, both Black Tiger and Fu Jiao Pai, the beginners begin learning all five animals, and then they specialize in the tiger. So to this day, I think he was at least a couple of years ago, still running his Black Tiger Kun. And he also was a guy that invented and marketed that Zen staff that Jonathan was showing you
Oh, yes.
a week or
Oh,
so
okay.
ago. Yep, that's his
The one that
also.
that you put together.
Yep,
Oh, awesome.
yeah, yeah. He was pretty much a genius martial artist. Then also coming out of the Fujao Pai system was one of my favorite guys. It was Paul Vizio. It was an Italian kid from, I'm pretty sure he was from the old Italian enclave in the northern part of Alphabet City. And he started training with Hua Hong and Fujao Pai in the 60s also, and went on to become a very, very famous martial artist. One of his first claim to fame, one of my favorite stories, is apparently late 60s, early 70s, some young guy came from Hong Kong and went to Hua Hong and said, I'm so and so. I've studied with such and such, and I want to start a school here, but I must be famous. Will you get me a fight with the Black Dragon? And Hua Hong looked at him and said, you look a little small to be fighting Ronnie Van Cleef. He said, no, no, I must fight the Black Dragon. And he's like, I don't think that'd work out too well for you. He's, I can do it. I must do this. And Hua Hong goes, well, I got a guy that's about your size, an Italian guy. Chinese here love Chinese versus non-Chinese. And, and the thing is, Paul Vizio was a featherweight and lightweight. Plus Ronnie Van Cleef's like light heavy.
Right, of
But,
course.
so apparently this guy was like Paul's size, featherweight, lightweight size. And so he says, okay, I'll beat this guy and then I'll fight the Black Dragon. So they blocked off Bayard Street and put a ring in the middle of the street. And the Chinese came, and it cost a lot of money laid on this kid from Hong Kong just because he was Chinese.
Right.
So they square off, ding, ding. They come out, feint, feint, bang. Paul lands his first punch and knocks the kid cold. One punch, out like a light. And the Chinese bettors are going insane. This must be fixed. That guy couldn't have lost this easy and whatnot. So Hua Hong goes over to Paul and goes, the bettors are going crazy. Would you mind doing that again? Oh, no, that's no problem. So they wake the kid up and they send him out against Paul again. And Paul carries him for about 3/4 of a round and then bang, bang, knocks him out again. And the Chinese had to admit that their guy wasn't that good and pay up. That was one of the first times that Paul was seen. And then he won the Fujao Pai tournaments regularly. And then he got into the PKA, Professional Karate Association, called Full Contact Karate then, but one of the first kickboxing organizations in the United States. And he actually became their world lightweight champion.
Oh, wow.
And before he was done competing, he had won titles in 4 weight classes. Featherweight, super featherweight, lightweight, and super lightweight. He had won them in 3, 4, 5 organizations, and he had amassed a record of 47-1.
Wow.
One loss. And that one loss is an amazing story in that he was scheduled to meet Cliff Thomas, lanky, powerful black kid out of Texas. They were going to fight in D.C. And Cliff went out first. And then Cliff's trainer at that point, a famous full contact fighter named Demetrius the Golden Greek Havanis, was flying out later in a private plane. And the plane crashed and Demetrius died.
Oh, wow.
Now, and he and Cliff were close. It wasn't just a student or a trainer. They were close. And you never know what's going to happen when that happens. Either the person's going to fall apart and they can't do anything, or it's going to give them some kind of laser focus where they fight the best fight of their life. Like what happened with Buster Douglas. When he met Tyson, his mom had died 2 weeks before.
Mm-hmm.
And he got that laser focus thing and beat Tyson and never fought that well again.
Right.
Well, Cliff Thomas showed up with this laser focus. And Paul had apparently had some kind of jaw injury in training, but he didn't think much of it. No one ever beat him.
Right.
And he and Cliff went to war. And Cliff broke his jaw. And I don't know if it's true. I heard jaw, nose, cheekbone. May have been just a jaw. But his corner didn't want him going out with these injuries. And Paul was, no, I'm still going to fight. And they go, no, you're not. And he lost his title to Cliff. So he went to the PKA and told them that if they didn't give him Cliff in a rematch in his next fight, he wasn't going to fight for them anymore. He'd fight for another organization. And he was a big star, so they gave him Cliff. And they met in the small room at Madison Square Garden. And I was there live for that one. I was in the audience. Yeah, what a fight. One of the best prize fights I've ever seen. I mean, Cliff had the type of confidence that you get when your last fight, you knocked the guy out, basically. Didn't knock him out, but stopped him
Of course.
on
Yeah,
a
breaking his
technical
jaw,
knockout. And Paul was like, this just isn't going to happen again, period. And the first few rounds, those boys were at each other, nip and tuck, bang, 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 back and forth, banging the hell out of each other. And then slowly, Paul's stamina starts to take over. You can see Cliff's like, I hit this guy with everything I hit him before, and this time it's having no effect. Slowly, Paul starts to take over, until his stamina is obviously way beyond Cliff's. In the 11th round, Cliff's lucky that he missed it by about an inch because he would have torn Cliff's head off. But in the 11th round, just to show the kind of energy he has, he threw a flying, spinning heel kick.
Wow.
About Cliff was taller than him, about 3 feet in the air, spinning, and missed Cliff by, an inch or so or less, just to show he had the energy to do it. And Paul, of course, took his title back that night and never lost again, 47-1.
Wow.
And they said he was given the okay to start a school in New Jersey. So he was one of the first two guys, him and Huey, who were allowed to start official Fujao Pai school somewhere else. And he still has his school in Jersey. In the wrestling anomaly, Paul keeps his personal life to himself to the point where no one knows how old he is. He has never told anyone how old he is. But for the timing and the assumptions, people figure he's got to be just about my age.
Right.
Which would mean that he was still fighting and winning full contact kickboxing in his 50s.
Wow.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing guy, Paul Vizio. And in 82, when we decided to venture into the Fujao Pai tournament scene, he was still one of the officials. He was judging and refereeing. He didn't happen to work any of our matches, but he was judging and refereeing. And that was an experience and a half. We had never fought in any tournaments ever. We'd had the association for 3 years and been training, and we didn't know anything about fighting in tournaments. And Mr. Chan told me, he said, first tournament, you never win. You better be ready. Never win first tournament. And of course, as usual, BP Chan was absolutely correct. Absolutely correct. I had one guy doing Bagua for him. I should never have put him in a tournament that did not have a beginner's division, just forms, because he was an absolute beginner and no one else was. Didn't look so good. And then,
were those tournaments mixture of forms and then matches, and how were they being ran at that time?
They rented a public school auditorium and they put the fights on the stage. And this will give you an idea what they figured was important. They put the fights on the stage and they put the forms in the space behind the seats. And ran them simultaneously. I mean, hardly anyone even turned around and looked at the forms, period. And if you didn't know somebody who was competing in forms, you paid no attention to it. It was not what it was about. And these were still, full contact. And when my people started competing regularly in the 90s, it was supposed to be controlled contact. A lot of it wasn't, but it was supposed to be. This was mouth guards, cups, 10-ounce gloves, try to knock each other out. That was the object.
Right.
And I remember before we went up, there was a couple of featherweights fighting, little guys. And the referee called break, and one of them stepped back and dropped his hands, and the other guy didn't hear the referee. And as the guy dropped his hands, he stepped in and nailed him full blast as hard as he could in the jaw. And the guy dropped like he'd been shot. And whenever there was an injury, the Sifus would converge from the four corner judges because they all did trauma medicine. So they all converged and they all started trying to wake this guy up. And 5 minutes later, they still haven't woke him up. 6, 7 minutes later, they still haven't woke him up. They carry him out limp as a dish rag with everybody going, is this guy dead? It's like, they carry him out. We later found out they had him out on a bench outside. He woke up, thought he was still in the fight, and wanted to come in and fight some more. And they're like, no, that's not happening. But when they carried him out, he looked dead. So they called the next fight. There'd been a break and a little behind. They usually had one fight going and one on deck, and they were behind. They called the next fight, and it's my assistant and best friend, Guy Pascuzzo, is fighting next. And then they call the on deck fight, and it's me. So they just carry this guy like he's dead, and then we're going up right afterwards. and I go up, and my friend Guy's fighting some Shaolin kid, and I'm getting my hands wrapped and gloved and looking like this and watching it. And the first 10 to 15, maybe 30 seconds, all of a sudden, bang, the kid hits Guy. Guy goes down. Guy gets up, shakes it off. And unfortunately, at this point, they'd cut it down to 1-round fights because of they're running out of time.
Oh, right.
When I was judging later, I used to tell the fighters, don't blame us. The time is judged by rent. The rules are judged by insurance. We don't have anything to do with either of them.
Right.
But so they're down to 1 round fights, and Guy got up and beat that guy so thoroughly for the rest of the round that one of the judges actually voted for him, even though he'd been knocked down, and he lost a split decision.
Oh wow.
So I go up next, and I'm fighting this White Crane fighter. There's an interesting school from Brooklyn that I saw that once. I don't know where they came from, where they went to. I guess they were a small school that just appeared here and then didn't get any other publicity, but they were good. No doubt about it, they were good. I was interested. Every one of them was dark as the ace of spades, and they were the White Crane school.
Yeah.
But we square off. I start moving in. He goes to the edge of the mat and drops his hands down to his side. I didn't know anything about White Crane. I didn't know that was their guerrilla stance to set stuff up. I see a guy with his hands down. So I move in to throw a left hook, and the next thing I know, I'm sitting down. It's like, God damn, I'm sitting down. The referee's about to count, and I jump back up because I'm terrified he's going to say 10. I later heard from my guys he was going to say 1. I had been down for a split second, but I was gone for that split second, so I was afraid he was going to say 10. So instead of taking some time to clear my head, I leaped back up. And he came in to finish me off and got a little sloppy thinking he had me, and I caught him with 2 good left hooks. And stunned him, but I didn't manage to knock him down. And then the rest of the fight, I chased him around the edge of the mat and was bouncing overhand rights off his shoulders and spinning back fist off his chest, but couldn't get another solid piece of him after those 2 left hooks. And he was, to his credit, scoring a series of side kicks to my hip and waist, which kept pushing me off. Kick me, push me off. I'd come back in, kick me, push me off. And he was landing them pretty good. So, of course, he got the decision on that one. And then our only other guy was a friend of mine who promised us he would fight, and then didn't show up to train for 2 months before the fight. And, he'd been a street fighting kid. He was tough and whatnot, but he hadn't trained at all. But he's like, I promised you, so I'm here. So, and he was a little bit bigger than us, a bigger guy. And not much, and he goes, and I see him when he sits down. He's looking a little nervous, and all of a sudden he sticks his head out, and staring at the guy across from him. Like, what? I'm like, what's he looking at? Well, later we discovered what he's looking at. The guy that he's facing had a scar around his neck from ear to ear where somebody had cut his throat and he had survived.
That's the guy he was fighting?
Yes. He was a scary looking guy. Now, later he came and talked to us, and he was a sweetheart. He was a really, really nice kid out of Newark. But somewhere along the line, somebody had cut his throat, and he had survived. Yeah, and so they come out, and it was a throat-oriented match, I guess, because they come out and they're moving around, and Mike's throwing a couple punches, and the guy's gearing him up, and then the guy throws a beautiful side kick for Mike's jaw. And Mike makes a wonderful decision to lift his jaw out of the way, taking it right in the throat. Spins around after getting kicked in the throat, and he's just kind of doubled over, holding his throat, and he turns back around. The referee says, "You all right?" Mike says, "I can't fight." The referee goes, "No, you can't. You can sit down and put some ice on that throat." I was running for the stage. I thought he was dead because he got kicked right square in the throat with a perfect side kick. But put some ice on his throat, and he was okay. That was our first tournament experience. But that was Fujao Pai with Paul Vizio as one of the officials.
Yeah. When I was growing up, I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s when there was a big karate school boom, right? There was like karate schools popping up all over the place. Was there a similar kind of time when you just saw a bunch of different kung fu schools? You said this random White Crane school from Brooklyn. Like, was that a thing? Like, they were just like popping up at some point?
Yeah, through the 70s, especially after 73, they started popping up. And, well, in New York, where we had a Chinatown, they were legitimate schools popping up. I mean, across the Midwest and whatnot, all of a sudden the karate school just started hanging out new signs that said Kung Fu. And they didn't change anything.
Wow.
But we had, legitimate styles were appearing. In 73.
Which is kind of what's happening now with schools destroying MMA on their sign, and they haven't been, they've been teaching one system but they're trying to get in on the marketing, and they're like, oh yeah, we can teach at least one more system. Let's call it MMA kind of thing. Yeah, it's the same kind of phenomenon. So you were
Yeah,
saying
well,
in 73?
in '73, Mo Yat came from Hong Kong
Mm,
and opened up his Wing Chun school. Very, very legitimate. He had been a disciple of Ip Man, and he opened up a school, and all of a sudden there was very legitimate Wing Chun in New York also.
mm,
And I think Vinnie Thomas was one of his students. I'm not sure, but he may have been from one of the other schools. There were some other Wing Chun schools that popped up. But when we were doing our competing in the '90s, having my people compete, and I was judging and whatnot, Vinny always brought his people. They were always well trained, good fighters, well trained in martial virtue, also polite guys and really good
mm,
fighters. And he's a good instructor. I think he was Mo Yat's student.
mm,
And of course, we already mentioned in the Tai Chi that William Chen and Chengmin Cheng had appeared in the '60s, teaching legitimate Tai Chi, and William with his Tai Chi kickboxing. And his people were competing in the Fujao Pai tournaments and the East Coast Kung Fu Federation tournaments also. In fact, his guy Ed Scott at one point was the light heavyweight champion of the East Coast Kung Fu Federation. I used to love to watch Ed fight because he was this very scholarly looking guy with glasses, and he'd get in the ring and there'd be some guy across the ring from him foaming at the mouth and whatnot. Ed would get in, take his glasses off, start looking around, blinking, looking like some scholar that was lost. And like, what am I doing here? And then he was a tremendous fighter. That same thing I talked about. What did I talk about? Um, when Ralph Mitchell fought Howard Lee. Did I mention that at Town Hall?
yes.
Um, and Ed had the same thing. This loose, lanky,
Mm,
deflect, 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 bang, 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 counter punch. He's really good at it, and it surprised a lot of people. I mean, we were at one tournament where we were just spectators, and the guy who was fighting Ed was warming up next to us, and he's one of these guys. Even in the stands, he was wearing his black silks, and he had the straw hat, and he was wound up tight as a drum, and half yelling to himself how he's going to murder this guy and whatnot, and pacing up and down and throwing kicks and punches up and down the aisle. And then he goes in against Ed, who does his lost scholar thing, and and then Ed annihilated him. I think Ed knocked him out with a couple of counter punches. It used to be fun to watch. And William also had a top student named Cecil Chu, who in the early '70s at Williams' actually insistence opened his own school on 6th Avenue and either 43rd or 46th Street, I forget.
okay.
First he taught for Aaron Banks, and then he got a following, and then he took him a couple blocks east and opened his own school, which he ran until he passed away a few years ago. But he used to train people in Williams kickboxing also.
Mm,
So he was putting fighters out. Domingo Colon, who ended up being a friend of ours and had a school in Westchester, was one of his fighters early on. Also one of the guys that studied with Mr. Chan, which is how I knew him. But yeah, so there was, I mean, the Tai Chi schools that fought in New York are generally known are William Cecil's and mine. And the other Tai Chi schools rarely, if ever, put anybody out in the tournaments.
mm.
And then, of course, in 1975, BP Chan came to Williams and started teaching Bagua and Xingyi, and a couple of Shaolin styles, and a bunch of Qigong, stuff that we hadn't had access to before. And that was just '75.
Right, because a lot of the
Uh,
early systems coming into the U.S., we mentioned offline to each other. You said how a lot of them were the southern-based systems coming out of Hong Kong and those kind of travel restrictions early on.
yeah, it wasn't anybody coming from mainland China. Everybody was coming from either Hong Kong or Taiwan, although Taiwan did have a fairly decent proliferation of northern styles.
Mm,
But they're either from one of those two places. And
mm,
also in the late '60s, Ron Rosen started his school, sort of amalgamated martial arts, but based on the very rare northern kung fu of Great Wheel Kung Fu. And he had been a student of his grandfather, who was one of the most colorful guys in history that more people should know about. His grandfather was Joseph the Mighty Adam Greenstein. And Joe by that time was an old character, white haired down to his chest and big white beard and little short guy. That's why he was the Mighty Adam, Atom, Adam, the Mighty Adam. And he was primarily a strong man. So what
That's what it
happened with
sound like.
Joe was when he was a kid, he was a sickly kid, and he actually ran away, didn't tell his parents, ran away and joined the circus and became the apprentice of the Russian strongman slash wrestler. And they went on this tour for like 3 years, where he's from Poland, where they went from Poland all the way to China, around to India, back up through Persia, and finally back to Poland. And by the time he got there, training with this Russian wrestler strongman, he was a powerful young man, not big, but a powerful young man. And the thing is, he and the wrestler used to train with the local martial arts guys. When they're in China, they train this great wheel kung fu. In India, they trained with the Indian wrestlers. In Persia, they trained with the Persian wrestlers. They used to train with whoever they traveled by. And then shortly after he got back to Poland, he married this girl and they moved to the United States. And he got into it was early enough that there was still professional wrestling that was real. And he got into that and actually won some lightweight, featherweight, some lighter weight title in that. And he kept trying businessmen. And unlike the legendary Jewish businessman, he was horrible at it. It's like business failed after failed. So eventually he came up with this idea after he'd moved to New York of creating his own health program and his own health products, soap and lotions and food additives and whatnot. And a lot of it based on traditional kosher stuff.
Mm.
And he opened up a booth on Coney Island where he would sell his products and he would do his strongman stuff to attract people to bring them in to sell him his products. And this was the 1930s when there was a very strong American Nazi party. Guys who were
Mm-hmm.
pro Hitler, pro Nazis, very strong. And he was, everything was upfront Jewish. This is my strength comes from the Kabbalah.
Yeah.
My products come from kosher teaching. And so he was constantly fighting with Nazis that would show up at
Mm.
his booth. And he was a little short guy, so they'd try and pick on him, and he did waste him. He had all this martial training, and he
Nice.
got so he was pretty crazy about it. At one point, he's out in Queens, and he heard this German lecture and whatnot going on. He asked people, and he was told the local Nazi Bund meeting was happening at this second floor of this building there, and he ran and got a ladder. He couldn't find the door and was climbing up the ladder to the second floor. When they heard him, they came out and they shook the ladder, and he fell off, and he got up and started fighting with a bunch of them. You know, when the police appeared, he had some slight bruises, and 4 or 5 of the Nazi guys went to the hospital with broken bones,
Nice.
jaws, noses, arms. It's like he was quite a character. And he trained Ron.
Mm-hmm.
And Ron also learned um, that Sifu's trauma medicine thing I was talking about and was the official medic for a lot of the fighting tournaments that went on in the city at that point. They'd get Ron to be the official medic. And eventually he moved to Denver and opened a school that he ran in Denver for the rest of his life.
Mm.
But the connection there is Ron Rosen was my teacher, Jan Lang's first kung fu teacher.
Ah, okay.
So, you know, that was the connection there. He was the first teacher. In fact, I have this picture of the school. I'll send it to you at one point. It's great that his is the Ron Rosen school when his grandfather was visiting.
Mm.
So it's got my first teacher with his first teacher with his first teacher. Because it's got Jan and Ron
That's cool.
and Joe Greenstein. And Jan used to talk about when Joe came to visit, he would like do his strength routine and tell him stuff like it's hold the horseshoe, and he'd go, "When I put on a show, I grunt and groan." But it really has nothing to do with that. I just think it's a coat wire. As he would say, coat wire, he'd straighten the thing. And he'd do the same thing with a railroad spike, bending it. Yes, I just think of it as a light piece of wire, and he'd bend it as he said it. It's like amazing. And then one of my favorite things of Joe Greenstein was Jan also said at one point he did this demo where he had his grandson, who of course was their teacher, who handled all of them tremendously. He knew a lot of nerve pressure point locks and whatnot because
Mm.
in his grandfather being a wrestler as well as this great will kung fu thing, and really handled him. And all of a sudden, he's with his little old grandfather, and he attacks and he hits the floor. And he jumps up and he attacks and he hits the floor. And this goes on for a while. Bang, bang, bang. Every movement, he ends up hitting the floor. And then the old man stops him and looks at the students and goes, "You see, he's just like you, except he gets up faster."
So yeah, so
Uh,
it
and the Ron
during.
Rosen
Oh, go
School,
ahead.
by the way, the Ron Rosen School in the West Village was noted for if there was some type of dissident group at all, he had a class for them.
Mm-hmm.
Revolutionaries, he had a class for them. Lesbians, he had a class for them. I mean, if there's
Mm-hmm.
any type of offshoot group at all, he would have a class for them.
Nice. Well, that's kind
Um,
of one of my questions is going to be, in that boom in the '70s, when you were on the scene, who were the typical folks who were trying to train in kung fu? Because I feel like my picture of who was training kung fu back then was more, kids and folks from, like, poor working class neighborhoods, who were also trying to, like, you know create self-defense in real tough situations. I mean, what does the New York experience do? Like, what does New York, how did it influence Chinese martial arts? Not just, Chinese martial arts coming to US, but what did the New York scene and the New York temperament and all that stuff, what did it do for martial arts?
well, I've mentioned before, in the early days, a lot of people were training for self-defense in all the different martial arts in New York City. New York City in 60s, 70s, most of the 80s was relatively tough, and you had to kind of know how to handle yourself on the streets. And that was the initial maybe people, and there was a lot of people doing that. But I would say when it comes to Chinese martial arts, there was no typical students. There was any type of walk of life you could think of. There were people showing up who wanted to learn kung fu. A lot of that was because of the kung fu movies and the kung fu television show, et cetera, et cetera. That may be what drew a lot of people. But for whatever reason, there was no typical kung fu student. They were all different types of people from
Mm,
all walks of life.
mm.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting too because, you know, I think the popularity of all the kung fu movies, even my father, who grew up during that time, he was a boxer, but he was just inspired by all the kung fu, and there was and always wanting to, do some kung fu moves that he saw like some of his friends do or whatever. So it had a real big influence, I think, on the scene of like the combat sports and fighting scene in New York throughout the '70s. But there's been an ebb and a flow, right? It hasn't been always as popular. There's been some dips, other systems. I mean,
well,
now I think the big thing is, jujitsu or MMA is a big thing.
well, as I said, William Chen told me that the reason we're lucky in Tai Chi to have the people who study it just for health is because the popularity of the martial arts goes up and down and up and down, and the people who study for health will be there all the time.
Mm,
Pretty much what it looks like in the United States in general, New York in particular, the 1950s was the time of judo. The 60s was the time of karate. The 70s was the time of Chinese kung fu. The 80s was ninjutsu. The 90s was Brazilian jiu-jitsu. And the late 90s through the 2000s is mixed martial arts.
mm,
So different things have their different popularities going on. And of course, this whole thing of a couple of guys in China challenging all of the old Tai Chi matches that they can get to fight and beating the hell out of them is not helping the internal
right.
scene at all. But you'll notice there are guys out there that do Tai Chi and Sandan, Tai Chi and kickboxing. There's some young, tough guys that are doing internals, and they're never fighting them. They're finding some older guy and usually some older charlatan. The guy that
Right.
started this was correct that there are charlatans out there claiming they can do energetic stuff, and you get them in an actual fight and you discover they get knocked out immediately. But there are people doing internals at fight, and they aren't going anywhere near them. They're, finding these older guys, especially older charlatans, and they're easy. They're
Mm-hmm.
easy and they look
Mm-hmm.
easy, but unfortunately, people are thinking that that's Tai Chi. I mean, that first fight was ridiculous. The guy who's representing MMA and got in all the trouble in China for beating up a whole series of old masters was basically self-taught in MMA. And the first Tai Chi guy that he fought had developed his own style of Tai Chi. It's like neither of them are what they were supposed to be. um, so that hasn't helped much. But no, it goes back and forth as to which martial art, how popular martial arts are, and it's all a cycle. But there's always some people that are interested in training. And as I pointed out in our very first episode, there's a big difference between training in classical martial arts and training in fight sports and training in close quarters combat, which a lot of people don't get, especially because schools try to do some of each. You develop a sport version of your style so that people that want to compete can, like William Chen's kickboxing, and you teach self-defense, which is kind of like, but not exactly close quarters combat. And but they're major differences. Classical martial arts, as we said, the study of a specific style of a specific time, and you're learning like a historical style, which obviously worked great at its time, or you wouldn't know about it, but it may not necessarily work as effectively now. And you're supposed to be learning the style plus the history plus the philosophy plus the health aspects, and all of it put together makes it an art. So it's classical martial arts as opposed to sport fighting or close quarters combat, which is military fighting.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't understand that. You start mixing the two, and sometimes they just don't mix so well.
Right. And I think there's also this general sense that combative sports are like the only way to prove that your system works. That's what a lot of people argue. Oh, I'm doing this because it actually works in a fight. The other stuff, the flowery stuff, doesn't work in a fight. And
Yeah, but
there's no large organized Chinese martial arts tournaments these days that are getting big publicity to see Chinese martial art application per se.
but even so, when they're doing it tournaments, it's becomes sport fighting,
Right.
and there's a difference between all-out fighting and sport fighting. I like to point out the armbar that Ronda Rousey made famous.
Right.
Well, the first scene of Bruce Lee's biggest movie, Enter the Dragon, he shows how to deal with that. Sammo Hung puts him in that armbar, and he sinks his teeth into Sammo Hung's Achilles tendon, and Sammo Hung lets go of the armbar.
Yep.
It's small digit manipulation. In basic jujitsu, most basic styles, they'll tell you one of the first things you do if some big guy grabs you is his weakest point's his little finger. You peel that back and bend it till it breaks. No one's ever done that in MMA. That's how you know when they said the original rules were no biting, no gouging, everything else goes. How come nobody broke anybody's fingers? They weren't even wearing the gloves to get in the way in those days. It would have been
Right.
easy. Obviously, they were told no small digit manipulation.
Right.
And, biting, gouging, yanking on
Groin
vital
strokes,
parts.
strikes. Yeah.
Yeah, groin pull. I mean, there's a whole prison style based on the technique they call um, slap, grab, and pull, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's like, it's like, yeah, it's pretty self-explanatory. Slap, grab, and pull. But this stuff it's different. So sport fighting isn't exactly all-out fighting either. I mean, it's like in the fairly early UFC when they were having a lot of the reality show with the kids living together, and two of the guys got in a fight in the porch, and one guy put the other guy in a perfect triangle choke, and before he could tighten it up, the guy picked him up and slammed him. And you do that on the mat, it just tightens up the triangle choke, and you go out, but it wasn't a mat; it was a cement base on the thing, and he slammed it, and that was it. The guy was semi-conscious and let go of him and whatnot. And you could see right there the difference between getting slammed on a mat and getting slammed on the cement. Of course,
Right.
they both got kicked out of the house and never allowed to fight in the UFC. But it was an interesting
Yeah, it shows. Yeah.
observation of the difference between sport fighting and all-out fighting. Getting back to New York
Yep.
Kung Fu before I'm done here, you also had Frank Yi, who was a Hung Gar stylist,
Mm.
who was a well-known teacher in China, who came to New York in 1973 and had backing, had money. He opened up schools in a couple places in the city, in New Jersey. He opened up a number of schools, and they were teaching really high-level Hung Gar. Hung Gar was his thing. And his top student was a guy named Pedro Sapero, and he actually officially adopted Pedro to where Pedro's name now is Pedro Sapero Yi.
Oh wow.
And yeah, and Pedro, goes to China with him. In fact, when China opened up, he went back to China, and he's the only person I know of that has branch schools in the United States and in China, the same organization. Frankie is pretty highly respected, and Pedro's a really high quality martial artist who happened to be one of the sweetest guys in the world. Just really, really nice guy. And he ran a tournament in New Jersey for a while, which we used to compete in. It's where Tina won a bunch of her stuff. And very, very well run tournament. And he's the kind of nice guy that when a couple of my buddies, Ben Hill and Novell Bell, wanted to start an all Bagua tournament, but it was obviously going to be very small. As I've said, not that many people do Bagua, period. And it was hard to get a place, to have any money to rent a place. Pedro let us have a section of his tournament. He gave
Oh
us what
cool.
would be one ring of like a 8 ring tournament to run our little tournament inside of his tournament.
Oh, very
It
cool.
was, yeah, very cool, very nice guy. And those tournaments are interesting, all Bagua. It's like with Bagua fighting and Bagua push hands, Bagua forms. It was
Nice.
pretty interesting. Some of my guys did really well in that also. But it's because of Pedro that it happened. We never would have found a place to do it. And then you had Chantai San's Lama Pai. And he was another one that was a teacher in China. In fact, he taught the Chinese military.
Mm.
And Lama Pai is a Chinese variation of the Tibetan lion's roar style. And it's even more rare than Bagua. I think there's only 5 or 6 teachers in China.
Yeah, and I've never heard of it.
And and she came to the United States, New York. It was 80s before I knew of it, but he may have been there before then, and was teaching openly. And his number one student was David Ross. And one of the reasons that David got to be his number one student is because Sean never even attempted to learn English, and David's a linguist, totally fluent in
Nice.
Mandarin and Cantonese and Korean and Hebrew. I
Oh
mean,
wow.
he's quite the scholar. He's a kid as a child. He had leukemia and stayed home and studied. And then when he got better from that, he got into developing his body and has done martial arts continually. I think he probably started with Taekwondo in his teens or
Mm.
11 or 12 years old and has done martial arts ever since. And he became um, Chantai San's top guy. Another one of his top guys was Steve Ventura. And they started running tournaments in New York in the early and mid 90s. And they were the first tournaments that after that 1982 experience, we didn't do any tournaments until they started running their tournaments about 10 years later. And I was invited up and I became one of the initial judges and advisors in the thing. And I brought my people to compete a lot. And it was very, very well done, very nice Chinese tournament forms, push hands, sticky hands, fighting. They did the whole works. They ran that tournament for a while. And then they just wanted to deal with the fighting. So they started New York Sanda and they did Sanda tournaments, which I had some guys fight in also. Some did pretty well, some didn't. But We competed in their Sanda. They actually did a couple of Lei Tai platform tournaments where the platform, unlike the old platform, which is way up there, the platform's about 3 feet off the ground. But it's interesting, knock the guy off the platform counts as a knockdown.
Mm.
And the rule's two knockdowns
Even
and
if
the
they don't
round's
fall on
over.
their back or anything, even if they stumble out on their feet.
Well, no one, yeah, even if they land on their feet, you knock them off the platform.
Right.
And it counts as a knockdown. Two knockdowns wins a round. One of those tournaments, I had my guy, young Robert O'Bannon. He and his father trained, and they were known as Old Robert and Young Robert. They're actually Robert Jr. and Robert the Third. But young Robert was a heavyweight. He's like 5'10", about 225, really good fighter and genius. A lot of my fighters in those days were actually genius level guys. And he came in that day and he said, Frank, I had this dream last night that I'm going to fight the biggest guy in the building. And I'm like, well, you know how it goes, Robert. You get to the weigh in first, you weigh in and you stand in, you wait till your guy comes around, and you get to assess him and check him out. About 45 minutes later, he came back. He said, Frank, my dream just came true. He was fighting this guy who was like uh, probably in his mid 30s, late 20 years of kung fu, 6'4", 245,
Oh wow.
ripped. And Robert was kind of looked a little chubby, kind of loose guy, but tremendously powerful and tremendous will, like that brain and tremendous
Right.
will. But he was going to fight the biggest guy in the house. And they
He had some
squared
good
off,
foresight.
and the first thing the guy just sort of picked him up and threw him off the platform, one knockdown. And I saw Robert get back on. I saw this look on his face like that's not happening again. He told me later, he said, I decided he may knock me out, but he's not knocking me off this platform again. And by the end of the fight, Robert had taken him off the platform 4 times and won the fight.
Oh wow.
Yeah,
Awesome.
yeah.
Awesome.
Got underneath him with a couple of Shingi charges, and then at one point just did a Tai Chi push, and the guy grabbed him with this guy did some kind of eagle claw or something. I forget, praying mantis, some tight grip thing. He grabbed Robert's arms and Robert pushed him, and Robert just crouched down really quickly and ripped his arms out of the guy's hands as the guy was going off. That one. And the last one was a thing of beauty. Robert was his back to the edge, and the guy pushed him, and he did a spin and pushed the guy off. So he won it. It was great.
Nice.
It was one of those guys you'd like to keep fighting forever, but it's hard to keep them down on the farm when they go off and get a PhD in neuroscience and back it
Yep.
up with an
Yep.
MD. And still an adventurous guy. I mean, when he got his MD, one of the first things he did was go to Darfur as a volunteer doctor in Darfur for a year or so.
Oh wow.
Uh, like I said, genius guy. But yeah, those tournaments were really good. And to this day, David's still running New York Sanda, or maybe it's called New York Kickboxing these days.
Mm.
But he's still running that quite successfully. And Steve moved to Florida and is teaching and running his own Sanda Lama Pai thing in Florida.
Mm.
And then helping them, and one of the actually an equal partner in that tournament was a guy named Ty Nunez, who's a Hungar stylist. And when they decided they weren't going to do regular tournaments anymore, they were just going to do the fighting. He took over, and for 8 years, he ran the New York Summer Bash Chinese Martial Arts Championships.
Mm.
And, you know, we competed in all of them. There's a continuation of what they'd been doing before, but Ty was running it himself. And for 8 years, he ran that. That's where Tina started competing, was in that. That's where she won her fighting titles.
Around what time was
Um,
that? What years were those?
that would have been mid 90s to the
Early two
early
thousands.
2000s. Yeah. Or late 90s to the early 2000s
Mm.
in there. And so Thai was really significant on the Chinese martial arts scene at that moment also. But so we've had some pretty long-term classical schools, interesting characters in New York Chinese martial arts.
Yeah. And here and today, what do you? How would you assess the Chinese martial arts scene in New York as best as you can? You know.
Well, it seems to be at an an ebb stage. There's a bit less. There's no as far as I know, there's no specific Chinese tournaments at the moment, and schools are slower because this COVID thing has not helped. A
Yeah, for
lot of
sure.
schools closed and lost their space, including us. And it seems to be in an ebb stage, but it continues. It goes along. And as soon as things open up and they're allowed back in, I'm sure it'll grow again to some extent. You know, it has the problems of everybody's doing MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I know my clientele there's not many young fighters that show up anymore. I have some old fighters, but not too many of them. But then again, a friend of mine who's in business told me that your clientele always reflects yourself. So maybe just I've gotten older, so I have an older clientele. But
You got to get some
um,
of your younger ranked teachers to start expanding a little bit more.
yeah, well, the thing is, it's hard to find tournaments to fight in now.
Well, I think
Yeah,
when there's been a little bit of a shift in the laws around fighting sports in New York City, in the past 5 years or so, with the UFC kind of breaking into the market here. So maybe coming out of this pandemic, there is a great opportunity to start building up some tournaments in New York. And now with all the technology that we have access to with YouTube and all this kind of stuff, I mean, you pointed me to that new combat karate um, tournaments that are happening on YouTube. I think they have a YouTube channel. They're pretty awesome. So I think there's some opportunity coming out of the pandemic to get some Chinese martial arts tournaments and getting them, self televised. There'll be some great opportunity, but it takes a unique kind of character to organize these tournaments. I would say it's
well,
not a job for everybody.
it takes someone who's really giving. No one ever made any money on them.
Right.
I mean, and there wasn't big money like this combat karate. That's obviously big sponsorship. There's never
Yes.
any big money. They're just some dedicated people trying to put it together. I mean, the last of them was Novell Bell, the Black Taoist, who's the Bagua teacher up in Harlem. A friend of mine. In fact, we're brothers within the BP Chan system. We both studied with BP Chan. And Novell was really an excellent, excellent fighter himself. He was in the early David and Steve tournaments, and he was in the Ty Nunez tournaments, and I remember judging him and then watching him go on to become a major, major teacher himself. And
And shout out to him because
he,
I know he follows us and he engages with us on Instagram now. So I know he's listening to the podcast. So big shout out.
yeah, he's really good fight. He's also massive. I mean, he's 6'5", long arms and long legs. But he ran this tournament he called Man Up Stand Up, and we had some people compete in that. I had one guy do very well. Matt actually took a title there for a minute,
Oh,
um,
cool.
and did quite well. But that was supposedly it was interesting in that he'd give a lecture on how it's supposed to be controlled contact, and then he'd stand by the side of the screaming, "Hit them!" Everybody, no one did controlled contact, but he had to because of the way the insurance was set up. He had to give his little
Exactly. Yeah.
lecture on how it was controlled contact. But
Well, that's what I'm saying. There's been
it
that
was,
shift now, so there's some opportunity to get that even more legit. And actually, I saw some of the footage from some of those tournaments, and they were actually at my old Jeet Kune Do school, which used to be a Taekwondo school up in East Harlem, Garcia Gung Fu. So yeah, so that was cool to see that they were utilizing
yeah.
that cool space.
Well, he had to move around. It's one of those
Yeah.
things. It was another one of all intent and love of the sport and trying to get things going and just no real money behind it. And it's
Yep.
difficult. It's really, really difficult. All the guys eventually end up because it's thankless too. I mean,
Right.
you put on these things, you work as hard as you can, and what do you get? You get all the losers complaining to you all the time, and the winners just happy and going home and no comment at all. And you put up with a lot of grief and a lot of debt
Yeah.
for not much return. So it's really, really difficult to
Well, and I
run
would
these
imagine too,
tournaments.
a lot of the young kids who are coming up and they're doing well and can actually get into professional combat sports, they're probably going to go where the money is, and they'll probably mix in some MMA kind of stuff. So that's just the way things are, kind of thing. If the money's not there, it's hard to grow it out. But you know, hopefully, I mean, I know there's a lot of you know, we're not alone in being lovers of keeping Chinese martial arts alive here in New York and throughout the U.S. So hopefully we'll get that going. But yeah, we'll end it there because I just realized we're a little over time this week, a little longer than usual. But we tried to give you a decent scope of the Chinese martial arts scene in New York City. And next week, like I said, we'll be back. We're going to be getting back to the conversation of Bagua, but specifically, we're going to be talking about the weapons of Baguazhang. So that's going to be a cool episode. So check us out. Also, too, before we end this episode, Frank, I know because of the cold weather, you've shifted all your classes to Zoom classes. Can you talk about the different kind of classes that you're offering right now in this winter season? And then we can give some information how people can potentially sign up at the end of this.
Well, of course, we've been offering on Zoom our usual Taiji, Bagua, Xingyi, Qigong classes. But I figured for winter to replace the yard classes, I'd have to do something special because it's a different price to get in on the yard classes, and we wanted to keep that going for those particular days. So I'm doing 4 classes that I've never taught before, and Tina's doing her most popular class of Wu style, Northern Wu style sword training. And I'm going to do for the Fighting for Health people, I'm going to do a principles and fundamentals of internal fighting class.
Hmm.
And then I'm also going to do a Chinese philosophy class, which I've done workshops on, but I've never done as a class. And then for the Bagua folks, we're going to do a class on the 8 strategies of Chung style Baguazhang. Now, Chung style is based on 8 different strategies and what they are and how they work. And then we're going to do a Chinese weapons class where we're going to start off with the elbow knives, the Chen Tinghua famous elbow knives for the Chinese weapons class. So I'm going to do those 4 classes on Wednesdays and Fridays. Wednesdays, I think I'm going to do Bagua strategies and Chinese philosophy. And then Fridays, I'll do fundamentals of internal fighting and elbow knives. And Tina will teach, as I said, on Fridays, she'll be doing her Northern Wu style Tai Chi Ji and a straight sword. And of course, that doesn't include anything. We've got still got our regular classes on Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday as usual.
Yeah, I mean, you're teaching like 24 classes a week right now. It's pretty amazing. So yeah, so we'll have Tina's email actually in the show notes and on the YouTube comment section. I want to encourage everybody to really, you know, reach out to Tina. And this is a great you know, it's like the silver lining of this pandemic. This is a great opportunity for folks to access real, authentic, strong lineage systems of the internal martial arts with Frank, Tina, and others. And so, you know, shoot Tina an email, find out more details on what kind of classes are happening, how much they cost, how you can participate, and you can do it from wherever in the world you are. So we definitely want to encourage everybody to take advantage of that while it's around. All right, cool. Thanks so much, Frank. So we'll see you next week when we're talking Bagua weapons.
Absolutely.
All
Take
right.
care, Sean.
Talk soon.